Hello, my name is Ron Drummond. Welcome to Equitable Practices in Behavior Management. I'll be joined by my co-hosts Pam Corson and Nicole Trader Morganson, and we're with the Department of Special Ed. We hope this training will give you a new lens when looking at behavior management. So we're excited to get started. Let's go. We've tried to make this presentation as interactive as possible. So we've provided you guided notes in the course material. So throughout the presentation, we'll ask you to pause the video and complete an activity in the guided notes. So take a minute to make sure you can find your course materials and pull up the guided notes.
Before we begin the presentation, let's review a few agreements to use during the presentation and during the activities you will complete. The agreements are: be fully present. Use the next 90 minutes to fully participate, listen, reflect, learn, and question. Be honest and open. Lean in when there is discomfort. Question and reflect. A few activities will require you to reflect on what you have read and question from some of the learning. The last agreement: listen for understanding.
All right, guys, to get us started, we're going to watch this really cool video. All right, take a look.
It's just, there's all this pressure, you know? And sometimes it feels like it's right up on me and I can just feel it, like literally feel it in my head, and it's relentless. And I don't know if it's going to stop. I mean, that's the thing that scares me the most, is that I don't know if it's ever going to stop.
Yeah. Well, you do have a nail in your head.
It is not about the nail.
Are you sure?
It's just, there's all this pressure, you know? And sometimes it feels like it's right up on me and I can just feel it, like literally feel it in my head, and it's relentless. And I don't know if it's going to stop. I mean, that's the thing that scares me the most, is that I don't know if it's ever going to stop.
Yeah. Well, you do have a nail in your head.
It is not about the nail.
Are you sure? Because, I mean, I'll bet if we got that out of there...
Stop trying to fix it.
No, I'm not trying to fix it. I'm just pointing out that maybe the nail is causing...
You always do this. You always try to fix things when what I really need is for you to just listen.
No, see, I don't think that is what you need. I think what you need is to get the nail
See, you're
out.
not even listening now.
Okay, fine. I will listen. Fine.
It's just, sometimes it's like there's this achy, I don't know what it is.
I love this video. Oftentimes, we attend PDs looking for the latest and greatest strategy to reach the students we're having the most challenges with, or the students that need more resources than we think we have. So instead of taking a minute to realize you have a nail in your head, or you have to do something in your classroom a little or really different to reach that tough student, we hope we can just make a small adjustment and then they'll be fixed. And if they're not fixed or making improvement like we think they should, then maybe they just don't fit in our classroom. Our office truly believes that sometimes to get students back on track, we have to take that hard look at our practices, right? Listen when somebody's trying to tell us we have a nail in our head or that we should be doing something different in our class. You know, how we change the environment to make a difference or to really make things better for little Ronnie is gonna make a difference in that classroom. So by the end of this presentation, we have three outcomes. We're hoping you can develop an understanding of how your sphere of influence affects how you work with students with challenging behavior. We're hoping you can identify and use your own equitable behavior strategies to address challenging behavior. And we're hoping you'll be able to reflect on the norms, instructional, and behavioral expectations within your classroom to explore and evaluate barriers to equitable strategies within your classroom.
The Maryland State Department of Education, MSDE, has developed a guide to educational equity in Maryland called Equity and Excellence. In your materials folder, there is a link to open this document for reference during this presentation and for a closer, more in-depth look after this presentation. A few notes about this guide. Through MSDE's Network for Equity and Excellence in Education, representatives from all 24 local school systems, including 2 representatives from AACPS, joined together to develop focus areas and strategies to improve the achievement of all students in the state. This guide is meant to serve as a practical tool in the work that we do. The Equity and Excellence Guide outlines 4 areas of focus and was developed to provide the why through the use of data that illustrates the need to improve educational equity in the focus area. The how provides guidance in the examination of each focus area through an equity lens. The what provides examples of actions school systems can implement based upon the data and individual school needs. During this presentation, we'll take a look at Focus 4. This focus provides some data on educator and staff capacity, as well as improving learning experiences for every child in every classroom. Using some of the data and information outlined in Focus 4, we will look at promoting positive student outcomes as we work with students with challenging behavior, investigate and reflect on incorporating social emotional academic development, and examine how our behavior and instruction as we work with students with social emotional challenges can affect student outcomes.
Now, we really want to make this presentation really applicable to you and the things that you're seeing in your building. So the first activity in our guided notes is we want you to really define one of those challenging behaviors that you observe in your school. So in the guided notes under activity 1, we want you to identify a behavior you've observed this year in your school or a behavior you're expecting to observe when you return to school next year. What does that behavior look like? What does it sound like? And then define and describe the behavior in your guided notes. You'll have about 5 minutes to do this. So just pause the video and then resume when you're complete.
Thank you, Pam and Ron, for getting us started today. Let's get our brains primed to think about challenging behavior. Look at the question on the screen. How does working with challenging behavior make you feel? In a moment, you will see 9 images. From those 9 images, I want you to select the one that best answers this question: how does working with challenging behavior make you feel? The image you select can answer this question in a literal, metaphorical, intuitive, or aesthetic manner. Look at these 9 images while thinking of the question, how does working with challenging behavior make you feel? Please select a picture that best represents how working with challenging behavior makes you feel. Remember, this can be a literal, metaphorical, intuitive, or aesthetic choice. When you are ready, pause this video and on your guided notes, find Activity 2 in the middle of page 1. Write the picture you chose and why you selected that image. You will have 5 minutes to complete this. When you are done, unpause and continue the video presentation. I am curious to see which image each of you selected. We know that challenging behavior from our students evokes many emotions in educators. We often feel irritated, distressed, or disappointed. Challenging behavior can make us feel exhausted. Today, we will learn how to proactively and equitably manage these behaviors in order to maximize desired behaviors and create an equitable, responsive classroom environment. So, what is behavior? Behavior is anything a student does. Behavior can be positive or negative, acceptable and appropriate, or challenging. Behavior can be external, like yelling, or internal, like clamming up and not participating. A couple key points to remember. Behavior is a form of communication, and behavior is contextual. Every behavior communicates a need or want. Think about behavior in its purest form, an infant crying. The crying is the behavior the infant is displaying. There is a reason behind the behavior of crying. Why is the infant crying? Perhaps the infant is hungry or needs to be changed. The infant cannot express their needs or wants in any other way. Therefore, it uses behavior, in this instance, crying. Our response to an infant crying is typically not anger. We usually seek to find out what the need or want is that the infant is attempting to communicate. Now reflect on the challenging behavior Ron had you describe earlier. This student has an underlying need or want behind that behavior. For whatever reason, the student is unable to appropriately request or access the need or want. The student might lack the skills to request the need appropriately. The student's emotions might be so overwhelming in that moment that they cannot tap into the correct way to express themselves. The student may not have developed appropriate ways to express emotions, feelings, or needs, have not developed coping strategies, or cannot tap into those strategies in that moment, or do not know how to interact or react in that particular situation. Therefore, behavior occurs. Our job is to find out what the student is communicating through their behavior, just like we would with a crying infant. Also, behavior is contextual. That means behavior manifests in the context of the environment or setting in which it happens. Behavior is connected to the environment, that physical space, setting, stimuli, social situation in which it occurs. You probably see this with many of your students. They misbehave in one setting, say the cafeteria, but not in another, such as language arts class. Or a student might display challenging behavior when faced with a barrage of stimuli like noise and movement. That same student would not have those behaviors outside of that context. The behavior is directly connected to the setting. This is important information for us. When we realize this, we can proactively set up classrooms and schools in such a manner to induce desired behaviors and respond to challenging behavior in a way that does not reinforce it and creates an equitable learning environment.
Thanks, Nicole. That was great. We all want to be proactive. And when our students are struggling, it's a really tough situation. We see them struggle and we want to help. We want to do something to make it better. That's why most of us became educators, to help kids do well. When they aren't doing well, it's very challenging for them and for us. Let's take a moment to really think about why behavior is so challenging for us. Well, first, we're in charge. We're supposed to know what to do. But when a student is presenting challenging behavior, we start to second guess what we're doing. And when a student is really doing some potentially dangerous behaviors, we might be afraid of what they're doing. They might hurt themselves, hurt me, or even worse, hurt a student that we're supposed to be taking care of. So those fears keep building, and now we're afraid of failing, or worse, doing the wrong thing to help them or the other students in our class. We keep going down this rabbit hole of negative thinking and start to believe we're not equipped to deal with these behaviors. Or if we know what to do, maybe the structure of the school day doesn't allow us to address the things that we need to address. One way to refocus ourselves and move away from many of these negative thoughts is to tune in to the present moment. Like Nicole said before, behavior is communication. So if one of our students displays some challenging behavior, they are trying to tell us something. I know it's hard not to consider all the things you're thinking, but focusing on what the student is saying with his behavior is one way to bring us back into focus. So let's really take a moment to think about what is challenging behavior. Ross Green, a psychologist, he visited our county not too long ago, but he's written several books about students with challenging behavior. They include books like The Explosive Child, Raising Human Beings, and the one you see on your screen, Lost at School. He has a unique perspective on challenging behavior. He believes challenging behavior occurs when the demands being placed on the kid exceeds his capacity to respond adaptively. Let that sink in. What words jump out? Some of the things that jump out for me are demands being placed on the kid. Wow. So when we place demands on a kid, that's when we see challenging behaviors. And it exceeds his capacity. Whoa. So he doesn't have the capacity to respond adaptively in that moment. So Nicole mentioned earlier, sometimes a student might do well in the cafeteria or do well in language arts, but not in the cafeteria. So at that moment, he doesn't have the capacity to respond adaptively. Let's take a moment to hear from Ross Green himself.
You know, there are two philosophies that you could apply to a child who's not doing well. And in the case of the children that I work with, it's mostly kids who have behavioral challenges. You know, there are two philosophies that you could apply to a child who's not doing well. And in the case of the children that I work with, it's mostly kids who have behavioral challenges. What we've been believing about them for a very long time is the philosophy called kids do well if they wanna. The belief that if a child isn't doing well, isn't behaving himself, it must be because he doesn't wanna behave himself. He doesn't wanna do well. And I find that that's not the best belief system. I find that it's inaccurate, but I can tell you what it leads us to. It leads us to interventions aimed at making kids wanna do well. How do you make a kid wanna do well? We are all very familiar with the strategies. You reward the behaviors you like so as to see more of them. You punish the behaviors you don't so as to see less of them. And you are now in the business of making a kid wanna do well, founded on the belief that he didn't want to do well in the first place. Important question to ask. Why would any kid not want to do well? I mean, don't all of us do pretty much the best we can in pretty much most of the circumstances we find ourselves in? Kids do well if they can takes us in a completely different direction. It's the belief that if this kid could do well, he would do well, and that if he's not doing well, something must be getting in his way. The most important role that an adult can play in the life of a kid who's not doing well isn't to come up with yet another, more creative, more potent reward or punishment to make the kid want to do well, but rather to finally.
Wow, I love that. Really looking at what's getting in the kid's way and looking at behavior like we look at math issues or reading challenges, that it comes from deficits. Our kids have trouble with different areas of behavior, and we should treat it as a deficit, as a teachable moment.
Now that you know more about challenging behavior and why it occurs, consider some of the skill deficits students have or barriers they face. Students may lack coping skills. They may lack self-regulation skills. They may face barriers such as hunger, poverty, or divorce of their parents. These things contribute to challenging behavior. At the bottom of page 1 on your guided notes, you will find activity 3. The question, what are the skill deficits that lead to the behavior you described, is posed. Reflect on the behavior you described earlier in this presentation. Write down some of the deficits and barriers the student has. Please pause this video while you are doing this and then unpause to continue when you are finished. Take about 4 minutes to complete activity 3. Let's take a look at this graphic. This should look familiar to you from the Wednesday Equity PDs. This represents your sphere of influence. When thinking of the barriers students face, many of these feel way too big for us to help. Always remember that through your sphere of influence, there are things outside of your control or influence, things that you can influence, and things that you can control. Take, for example, a student experiencing homelessness. This situation is outside of our control, but we can influence certain aspects to support the student. We can contact the school counselor or other student services staff to provide information on resources like food banks, shelters, housing, and transportation for the family. That action would be inside our influence. We can control some things too. We can provide breakfast in the classroom no matter what time the student arrives. We can allow the student to complete homework during the school day, or provide them with the supplies they may be lacking due to their current situation. We can control the classroom expectations and norms through a lens of equity and understanding. Now, here is what I want you to do. Consider your sphere of influence in terms of your classroom or school. Using the guided notes on page 2, you will find activity 4. Please think of and list what is outside of your control and influence, what you can influence, and what you can control. You might write down that your school's master schedule is out of your control. However, you can influence the master schedule through a conversation with administration. And you can control the amount of brain breaks you provide your students throughout a long stretch of instructional time. So again, activity 4 is on page 2 of the guided notes. You will have approximately 7 minutes to complete this activity. Remember to frame this around behavior. What things are out of your control or influence? What things can you influence? And what things can you control? Pause this video for 7 minutes, then restart when you have completed activity 4.
Now, when we think about our sphere of influence, we often think about those things in our environment that we can control. But I also want you to take a minute to really think about those things inside of you that you control. And I want to talk about your buttons. We all have buttons, those little things that really bother us, right? A really quick story. Our buttons are really different. And one time when I was doing a observation, I was getting observed, and my principal was in the classroom, and I prepared a great lesson, and we were working. And one of my students, one of my students who typically is a challenging student, he was working and he was listening, but he was tapping his pen, as he was kind of learning. And that didn't bother me at all. I was rocking and rolling with my lesson and teaching, and he would stop and write, but then when he wasn't writing, he would go back to tapping his pen. And so my principal was there and she was observing me, and then all of a sudden she just yelled out, "Antoine, can you please stop tapping your pen?" And that was her button, right? That was the thing that really bothered her. So, one of the first things that we can do is really identify our buttons, really know what are those things that really bother us, right? And once we identify our buttons, that is when we can really help ourselves manage our buttons better. One of the things that really helped me and help, I believe, many of our colleagues manage our buttons is to first realize that it is important that we remain professional, right? We are professionals and we should remain professionals, right? Understanding what our buttons are, utilizing our resources, which are other teachers, and kind of using them to help us. If we know our buttons are tapping pins, or we have an issue with a particular thing like snot or something like that, then we need to know that and we need to remain professional in that. The other thing we have to know about our buttons is remembering we only can control ourselves in our environment, right? And once you kind of tip your hand and you let your students know that these are your buttons, then what happened? Every time my principal came into the classroom, all the students would tap, right? So remembering you only can control you. So really hiding your buttons is really important. Okay. And not expecting your students to follow through just because you said they were going to follow through, right? With the no tapping. But one of the biggest and most important thing to manage your button is to really understand and realize your perspective. Taking a minute to really think about, those things that you value, those things that are your personal biases, And I love this year how we really went through our equity training and really looked at identifying what our biases are, right? Our personal biases, our systemic biases, and then those world biases that we have. Okay. And really understanding and taking a minute to think about, your perspective on students, on work might not be shared with everyone. So understanding that and really looking at that is so important. And once you realize that people didn't grow up, the same way you grew up, so they don't hold the same values that you have. So really understanding that helps you put things in proper perspective. And it also helps us work with our students, okay? Not that your perspective is better than theirs or theirs is better than yours, just understanding that everyone comes from different perspectives and everyone's values are going to be the same. And one of the greatest things you can do is really work on building that class culture so that there can be those shared values within your class.
Analyzing your buttons, your values, and your worldview is an essential part of the work of equity. Now it's time to do some self-reflection. The work of equity and building equitable practices around behavior and instruction begins with ourselves. This next activity will take you about 15 minutes. It is a set of important reflection questions about your educational experience as well as current school norms and expectations. On page 3 of the guided notes, you will complete the questions in activity 5. Again, this is time for reflection, so you should take about 15 minutes. Please pause, then restart when you have completed these questions. Now that you have answered the questions in activity 5, I want you to read a very short article called Questioning My Own Practice. This article can be located in the Materials tab. There are no questions or activities to complete along with this article. I would like you to just take 3 to 4 minutes to read it. As usual, pause, then come back to the presentation when you are done.
That was such a great article. I love how the author was vulnerable enough to say that they really felt overwhelmed given that new curriculum. And I feel like that's where many of us are given this new approach to education in this virtual world. And oftentimes, when we feel overwhelmed, we tend to lean to our zero tolerance uh, kind of mantra. And we want to show people that we're the boss. But, this author did a great job of doing that self reflection and asked those tough questions, right? Like, am I doing everything I can to keep my students in class, right? Am I dealing with discipline? Am I dealing with discipline rather than bringing in those authorities like my assistant principal or principal? Am I fostering an atmosphere of mutual respect and recognition for my students? And then, am I offering those positive reinforcement rather than that negative feedback? I love that self reflection they did. And that really lends us to this integrated experience that we talk about in our CPI trainings. And the integrated experience is, especially when we're looking at challenging behaviors, it's first important to understand this integrated experience, right? It's the concept that behaviors and attitudes of staff impact the behavior and attitudes of students and vice versa, right? Your approach changes everything. It's basically saying what people say and do impact what others say and do. Are you doing those things that are important, like setting up my classroom so that everybody feels like it's a safe space? One thing we should always consider when looking at that integrated experience is our communication. When we look at communication, we've learned that communication is comprised of several parts. We typically think about communication with the words we use, right? We, when we're sending a message, our words only make up 7% of what we actually verbalize. The words are important, but it's not the most important component of communication. A larger component of communication is our paraverbal communication. This is how we say what we say. It involves our tone, our volume, and our cadence. But the largest and most impactful component of communication is our nonverbal communication. This involves our ability to pick up if a person is happy, if they're sad, if they're angry, or if they're scared. And this happens through their position, their body language, and reaction to our communication. See, communication is such a difficult thing to manage, especially with all the personal, cultural, and societal dynamics that are going on today. We're not always going to get it right. And being vulnerable enough to our students to say and to show this is a learning opportunity. Being vulnerable helps them know that they're not going to get it right all the time either, especially when it comes to communication.
All right, everyone, we have learned a lot of information. We are going to take a 10-minute break, so please pause this video for 10 minutes and then unpause when you're ready to return.
Welcome back from your break. Let's take a few minutes to review our learning, reflections, and guided notes activities. You completed activity 1 through 5 using your guided notes. We reviewed the purpose of the MSDE Equity and Excellence Guide and the 4 focus area components of the guide. We've spent some time in this presentation on Focus 4 actions of the MSDE Equity and Excellence Guide. You used your guided notes for Activity 1, and you described and defined a behavior that you have observed. In Activity 2 of your guided notes, you thought about how you feel when you work with students with challenging behavior. You learned that behavior can be external or internal and is communication or a means of communication. You used your guided notes in Activity 3 to reflect on skill deficits and barriers students may have that may contribute to behavior. You learned about your sphere of influence in Activity 4 and identified things that you can control or influence and some things that are outside of our control. You then used your guided notes in Activity 5 to reflect on and analyze your values and worldviews through responding to guiding questions. Lastly, the integrated experience and how we communicate and the way we communicate are impactful in our work with students. So what's next?
Now we're going to look at some data charts. This data chart, students suspended or expelled from Maryland public schools by race and ethnicity, is from the MSDE Equity and Excellence Guide that you previously opened and that I reviewed earlier in the presentation. This data chart is part of the Focus 3 in the guide, School Climate and Culture Affecting School Success. Why is school climate and culture affecting school success? This data chart is an example of 3-year trend data in the state of Maryland. Greater emphasis was placed on suspension and expulsion data starting in 2016. However, students of color have continued to be suspended or expelled at similar yearly rates. Please take about 3 minutes to review this data chart, then pause the video. Go to your guided notes to Activity 6 and complete Part 1 of the activity. You will respond to some guided questions and prompts after you view this data. Take about 3 to 5 minutes to respond to the questions in your guided questions document. When you finish Part 1 of Activity 6, unpause the video and continue with the presentation. Another MSDE reference document called Transforming the Culture of Maryland's Schools for Black Boys was a task force on achieving academic equity and excellence for Black boys. This is a resource guide for teachers. This document is in your materials folder if you would like to take a longer look after this presentation. Study Group 1 focused on social and emotional behavior supports. We will take a look at 2 data charts from this reference document, which are on the next 2 slides. Please look at Figure 5, suspension and expulsion data by gender, and then Figure 6, suspension and expulsion data by race and ethnicity. Pause the video and take about 5 minutes to respond to the questions in your guided questions document in Part 2 of Activity 6. When you finish Part 2 of Activity 6, unpause the video and continue with this presentation. Creating equitable learning environments is an important component of creating and providing equitable strategies with students with challenging behavior, including setting clear expectations for student learning and behavior that are consistently reviewed and communicated each day. An easy example in the Hanover Research Guide outlines teachers can communicate expectations using both explicit directions and nonverbal cues. Maintaining eye contact with all students while communicating expectations for learning and participation is another basic example of equitable strategies. The 2017 Hanover Research article is posted in your materials folder. It also includes equitable classroom practices observation checklist using 27 indicators to consider. This checklist was published in 2010 by the Equity Initiatives Unit at Montgomery County Public Schools. These recommended practices were developed to promote an equitable learning environment. We have provided you with several resources during this presentation. This data chart depicting the percentage of teachers who are rated as highly effective and effective is part of Focus 4 in the MSDE Equity Guide, Educator and Staff Capacity. This chart illustrates that approximately 97% of Maryland teachers were rated as effective or highly effective across the years of 2015 through 2018. Student performance measures, however, have remained largely unchanged from the achievement gaps for some student groups and measured by state assessments. To support your professional practices efforts in using equitable strategies in your classroom, the Office of Equity added equitable strategies to the Teaching and Learning Instructional Observation and Evaluation rubric. This document is located in your Materials folder. Although all areas of the rubric support instructional practices, the quality learning environment and student learning behaviors areas of the rubric provide strategies to support classroom culture and supportive behavioral examples. So next up, Ron is going to take a closer and more detailed look at the professional practices rubric as it relates to equitable strategies that can be used to support students with challenging behavior after going through a student case study with you.
Thanks, Pam. We're going to look at a case study, and this is from the magazine Teaching Tolerance. And the title of the article is A Teacher's Guide to Rerouting the Pipeline. So, this article is located in your class resources, and I'm asking you to pause the video now and take a minute. It's a quick read to read the article. When you're done, you can unpause the video. All right, welcome back. This is a great article because it shares some ideas about how teachers must shift their reactions when faced with challenging behaviors. Let's look at the verbal disrespect. He is defiant and uses inappropriate language when we ask him to do something. I'm sure many of us have seen this kind of behavior before. Well, a punitive teacher is going to send them out, but what does a responsive teacher do? They're going to shift one. In that shift one, they're going to look at the behavior that's really going on. What social deficits does Michael have in his communication? And then in shift two, they're going to look at how our behaviors might escalate some of his feelings that he's having right now. And then in shift 3 and 4, we're going to begin to investigate what can we do in our sphere of influence to really change some of the dynamics Michael's feeling in class. Pam mentioned earlier the Office of Equity and Accelerated Student Achievement. They're the liaison between our district and the community and is tasked with providing best practices to increase student support for academic achievement, social development, and positive relationships for our most disadvantaged students. They've developed this teaching and learning instructional observation evaluation rubric for professional practices. The rubric, it really focuses on several areas. Uh, Planning and learning, and under planning and learning, there's quality learning environment, preparing for student learning. There's also the section for teaching for learning. And under this section, there's instructional delivery and student learning behaviors. And then finally, they have assessing for learning. And this looks at assessment and closure of classroom activities. But for Michael's case, we're going to focus on that planning for learning, okay? And specifically, the quality learning environment. We're going to look at what we can do to really improve that quality learning environment for Michael. Now, the way the rubric is designed, under each heading, and we're looking at the quality learning environment, it identifies the area of focus and then what highly effective teachers are doing in that area. And then it also has some strategies that teachers can use in each of those areas that's going to lead them to become highly effective in that area. Now, for us, we're going to look at specifically what we can do in Michael's case. For some of our students, investing in some extra work to make them feel part of the community will be well worth it in the end for them and for the culture of the class. It makes our daily grind much easier also. So let's look at Michael. So the first area is that social interaction are mutually respected and positive. So what are some things we can do? Well, we can use strategies to find out more about Michael and his views through the good he wants to be, do, and have. We're always modeling that appropriate, respectful conversations with him. The next section looks at, is our classroom neat and organized? Have we arranged student interactions and reflect current student learning? So one of the things we can do for Michael is we can display students' work, ensuring that Michael's work is included. We can use materials that reflect his racial, ethnic, and cultural background all year round. The next section, or the next area, is each student sees himself as a valuable member and active participant in the class. So one strategy we can use is we can use affirming language and probe to include all student answers, especially Michael's, right? We can validate all perspective and making sure we're putting in that extra work. So we're making sure we're validating when Michael engages in the classroom. The next section looks at what routines are in place to create that safe and orderly environment. So what can we do? We can establish and consistently review the routines and expectations, responsibilities, and the rights of the class community. This can be done with affirmations, music, and class jobs that rotate routinely. So I'm going to make sure I look at those things that Michael's good at and give him those class jobs that really affirm him as a great person in that classroom community. Next, looking at performance expectations for learning are communicated. What can I do? We're going to make sure we're providing opportunities for student to student and teacher to student discussions. We're also going to look at that evaluation component of the classroom, making sure feedback is bilateral, right? So not only am I giving Michael feedback, but I want him to give me feedback on how I'm doing as a teacher and what I can do to better reach him. And then last, we're going to make sure each student has access to learning and meaningful participation. So I'm going to use teaching strategies aimed at Michael's strength and his needs. I'm going to use those opportunities to learn, or those opportunities for students to learn from one another and recognize their strengths and their passions. So those things that Michael's really good at, I'm going to make sure he has an opportunity to share it with his peers. Now, these are some of the strategies that are listed in that teaching and learning rubric. Nicole's going to share some other resources that are available around the county.
Let's think of some behavior resources that are available in Anne Arundel County Public Schools. This list is not exhaustive, and various schools and grade levels will have different resources. First, on the screen here is restorative practices. Restorative practices includes a set of practices such as classroom circles and restorative questioning. Our elementary schools have behavior toolkits, which are large containers with resources like star charts, visual schedules, and other behavior support tools. An executive functioning toolkit is available on the intranet and provides guidance on how to support facets of executive functioning. This toolkit has helpful tips and printable resources. Fun and function materials are available in some elementary schools as well as specialty sites. These materials are used for calming and sensory support. Alt 1 teachers are in secondary schools, and they have a caseload of students who have been identified as needing additional support around behavior or other school skills. We have approximately 34 learning labs across our elementary schools. The Learning Lab instructors provide small social skills lessons, breaks for students, and support generalization of behavior and social skills into classrooms. DMR is similar to Learning Labs in that it is a space that provides support to secondary students in proactive and responsive ways. PBIS is a positive behavior support system that is embedded throughout the systems of a school building. Many of our AACPS schools are identified as PBIS schools. Finally, on the screen, mentoring programs are available in a variety of schools and provide a slew of supports for identified students. Again, this list is only the beginning of the behavior resources we have available. It is certainly not comprehensive. In a moment, Ron is going to explain an activity you will complete using behavior resources.
Thanks, Nicole. So we've given you the rubric, some strategies from the rubric, and Nicole has just shared with you some resources our county provides that can help you address challenging behaviors. Now let's make it real for you. In the beginning, you identified a behavior that concerns you. You looked at some of the barriers for that behavior and the areas you can influence with that behavior. We want you to take the next 10 minutes or so looking at some strategies you can implement to address that behavior through an equity lens to ensure a quality learning environment for your student. Just like we did for Michael, on Activity 7 in your guided notes, you're going to identify some strategies in the rubric to improve the quality learning environment for your student. Your Michael, who displays the behavior you recognized earlier. So now, pause the video and come back when you've completed your rubric. Welcome back. I'm sure you've done a great job.
Congratulations! You have made it to the end of our presentation. Thank you for your time and effort today. Before you complete the post-assessment, let's review the outcomes once more. Today, you were able to develop an understanding of how your sphere of influence affects how you work with students with challenging behavior. Identify and use your own equitable behavior strategies to address challenging behavior. And you reflected on the norms, instructional, and behavioral expectations within your classroom to explore and evaluate barriers to equitable strategies within your classroom.
Thanks so much, guys, for spending this time with us. And we want to leave you with this thought. If a child doesn't know how to read, what do? We teach. If he doesn't know how to add, what do? We teach. If he doesn't know how to swim, what do? We teach. Doesn't know how to drive, what do? We teach. But if the child doesn't know how to behave, what do? Do we teach or do we punish? Thanks, guys. See you next time.